Well, we're getting into a new series of lessons tonight. We just wrapped up our summer series full of guest speakers. I hope that was a joy to you, but I'm looking forward to getting started with something new for the fall. Sometimes on YouTube, you can find entire lecture series or even entire college courses gathered together into a single playlist. From time to time, I will go search out some of these and listen to different lecture series that you can find out there on YouTube. In fact, recently, I got a little interested in the subject of ethics. It's a study of what's the right thing to do. And there is this free Harvard class on YouTube. It's a world-famous class on ethics where all of the lectures are there and available on YouTube. I got to listening to some of those lectures. It's actually really fascinating. Whether you agree with what is being said or not, it's eye-opening to hear how people are coming at this question. Like, what is the right thing to do? Now, that question is going to be important in some ways for our series. It's kind of hard for it not to be in any study of the Bible. But the reason that I bring up that Harvard class is actually for something else. It is for the number of views on those videos. So the playlist has 11 videos. Each one has 2 classes per video, so it's 22 full college classes. The first video, classes 1 and 2, has 34.7 million views. The last video, class number 11, has 700,000 views, which is nothing to sneeze at. I would be pretty thrilled if any of our College Hill worship services on YouTube had 700,000 views, but that is a pretty steep drop from 34 million views, lecture number 1, to 700,000 views, lecture at the end. And it's pretty much like that in some way, shape, or form with all of the lecture series or things that I look up on YouTube. Very often, whether the first impression that lecture makes a really strong impression, even if everything in quality holds up till the very end, it is just so much easier to catch attention than it is to hold attention. All of you teachers out there know this to be true. Well, tonight, we are beginning a new series in 2 Chronicles. And it is going to be our series throughout the end of the year on Wednesdays. I do not know what impression 2 Chronicles has made on you in your life, what impressions you bring to the table for this series. My guess is that for a lot of us, it's more or less a blank slate. The Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, are probably not one of those books that we turn to most often. If I were to ask you what's your favorite passage from the Chronicles, it might be kind of like when my dentist asks me how things have been going with my flossing, and I say, last time you did it, it was great. It's something we know is good, but it might be not something we turn to every night before bed. Now, if you have spent some time with Chronicles recently, you probably started with 1st Chronicles. And if you did, I hope you didn't do it at night right before bed, because if you start 1 Chronicles at the beginning, what you are greeted with is the longest list in the entire Bible. The first 9 chapters of Chronicles, it's a list of lists with more lists of names and more names. And my fear is that the view count on Chronicles really gets affected by that first impression that you get right at the beginning. It's so much easier to catch attention than it is to hold attention. But here's the deal. I've been doing this read through the Bible in a year thing challenge this year. You might not believe it when I say it, but of all the things that I have read so far, 2 Chronicles was the one that I just kept saying, like, I cannot wait to preach on this. I had to do some quarantining recently, I told you. It was the most boring sports watching week of the entire year. Just really a terrible sports watching week. I reread 2 Chronicles again. My prediction is that you're going to look forward to hearing these stories on Wednesday nights this fall, because 2 Chronicles is not like the first impression of first part of 1 Chronicles with the lists. This is really engaging stories and relevant lessons for our lives. If I had to sum it up, I would call it history worth repeating. Now, we talk about history sometimes in terms like that history repeating. Winston Churchill, for example, was famous for saying something. You could probably finish that sentence. Those who fail to learn from history are what? Do you remember? They're condemned to repeat it. And he wasn't the first one to say that, actually, but it was Winston Churchill saying it in 1948 that kind of got very popular and stuck in people's minds. It's probably not surprising why. It's 1948. And it's just like 3 years ago that World War II has finished, and now all of a sudden there's all of these tensions brewing between the Soviet Union and the United States and England and the Western world. And Winston Churchill makes this call, this plea for repeating history, as in recalling it, remembering it, in order to avoid repeating history, as in, reliving it. It's like we don't have to go back down those roads again. We don't have to do the same things that we did before when we should have learned better than to do that. I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about what 2 Chronicles is all about. We should think of this book as doing, in a sense, what Winston Churchill was trying to do. And I want to show you why with a little timeline here. So, the book's called Chronicles. They were written somewhere around here. So we're in the time before Christ. Most people think that the Chronicles were written around 400 BC. So 400 years before the time when Jesus came. And what that means is that when these books were written down and they were shared, it was written after this really seismic event that we talk about sometimes called the Exile. And when we study the Old Testament, it's not surprising, pretty often, someone will make mention of the exile, because that was the time when, in 586 BC, the Babylonians came, they destroy Jerusalem, they tear down the temple, they bring a lot of people away to Babylon, and for the next 70 or so years, God's people are kind of stuck. And it's a terrible, world-altering experience. They're stuck in exile. But then, slowly but surely, things start to turn around. People start to come back home. And then they start to have these great successes. So a group of them comes home in around 515 BC. They rebuild the temple, new temple. And then about 445 BC, you remember Nehemiah and his return. They rebuild the wall. That was 445 BC. And then around 400 BC, is when the Chronicles were written. So, notice that it's been about 50 years after the wall was rebuilt. We're getting a little over 100 years now after the temple was rebuilt. It's at this point that the writer of Chronicles tells his history. He tells this history when the memory of these great triumphs is really starting to get back there in the rear view. He tells this history at this point when God's people are starting to kind of settle into the daily grind of life here in Jerusalem and back home again. They've been there for a while. He tells this history at this particular place in time after the exile's return. But the history he tells is not about this time. after the exile's return. The history Chronicles tells is about this period before that. It is not until we get to the very last chapter of 2 Chronicles that the exile happens. It is not until the very last verse, the last verse of 2 Chronicles, that this promise is made that God's people will get to go home after the exile. The promise is actually that they'll get to go home and build a house for God. The promise is of these successes on the other side of the exile. That's the very last verse of 2 Chronicles. But the people who are reading 2 Chronicles, by the time they're reading it, they know that that all happens. It happened 100 years ago for them. The whole book builds toward this promise that they already know happened. So why tell this history? Why write a history about all these things way back here before exile? Why tell the story of 2 Chronicles? Here's another layer to that question. Why tell this history when it's already been told? So 1st and 2nd Chronicles tells the story of the kings of Judah. Well, it starts even before it's just Judah. It starts with Saul in 1st Chronicles and David in 1st Chronicles, and then you get to 2nd Chronicles, you get Solomon, and the temple breaks in two, and then the whole rest of the way, it's the kings of Judah. There's about 20 more of them. That story has been told before. Chronicles lets you know it. So just about every time it introduces you to a king, one of the things it says at the end of telling you their story is something like this. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, from first to last, are they not written in the history of this place over here and this place over here? Now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam, from first to last, are they not written also in the records of this person over here and this person over here? These stories have been told before. We even have biblical books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, that cover a lot of the same territory. They were written before Chronicles. Chronicles seems to know those stories and even use them in writing this story. There's no question, in other words, that this is repeated history. So, why is it history worth repeating? I think the biggest answer is something like Winston Churchill's answer. And maybe one more detail on this timeline will help us see it. So the very first thing that happens in 2nd Chronicles is a major, major triumph. The book begins with the building of the first temple, Solomon's temple. And the history is the story of everything that happened after that. What happened after that triumph? What happened as that triumph got further and further in the rear view? And new challenges arose. And new temptations arose. And people and leaders from one generation gave way to people and leaders of another generation. What happened that led God's people from the triumph of that great temple to the Babylonians tearing it down? And how can these people living now, living here in the shadow of the second temple, like living in a similar kind of situation to the one that came before it, how can they now live in such a way where they don't repeat the mistakes of the past, where they actually make a better choice? See, this is what makes 2nd Chronicles history worth repeating. And I don't think that you have to look very far to realize that it's history worth repeating still today. So that's really what I hoped for in this series. So the history that Second Chronicles tells, I think, is worth telling still for us right now. We may not have that same temple timeline connection that we just looked at, but we share something much deeper. We share a lot of those same struggles with choices and their consequences that will make up the entirety of this book. We share the same calling not to stray to the right or to the left from a covenant that God has made with us that comes up time and time again in this book. We share the same hunger for and need for courageous leaders who will seek God with their hearts, which really makes a difference all throughout this book, whether you have them or whether you don't. We share the same deep need to return to God when we have strayed from God that we find over and over again. Maybe this is the most important theme of all in the book. It's kind of encapsulated by this verse from a prayer of Solomon in chapter 6 that we'll talk at length about in a couple weeks. When your people Israel, having sinned against you, are defeated before an enemy, but turn again to you, confess your name, pray and plead with you in this house, then God will hear from heaven. God will forgive the sin of his people and bring them again to the land, time and time again, so long as they keep turning and confessing and praying and pleading when they've sinned. God is ready to hear their prayers and ready to forgive them. And yet God continues to tell them, you've got to make the choice. So all the time in this book, you're going to hear the word if, because it's all about the choices we make. And if my people, God says, who are called by my name, humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I've set before you and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will pluck you up from the land that I have given you and this house which I've consecrated for my name. I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And regarding this house, now exalted, everyone passing by will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this house? And then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God and their ancestors. Those are the stakes of 2 Chronicles. And that's the choice that the people face. And it's really what makes this history, for them and for all the generations after, including us today, I think a history worth repeating. I like this book because it's not all one thing. You're going to find all kinds of positive examples in it that are worth repeating. And you find a lot of other examples too. And they're worth repeating as well. And if we do, we may find something important happens for us. By learning the history of these people that came before us, maybe we can actually learn to live lives that are worth repeating too. One that would be a good example to the next generation. One that would hold up well in the sight of history. Can we make choices today that would have good consequences for our children and the next generations that come after us? For the church in the present and in the future? Or will people look back on our lives and see a history worth repeating, but not for reasons that we want them to? A cautionary tale. Like, what will they see in us? That's a motivating question for me right now. I wonder if that's motivating for you. What will they see in us? Will our lives be a history worth repeating? And in what sense? I'll close with this. So I already said that this last week was the worst sports watching week for anybody who's doing quarantine. I stand by that. But there was one thing that happened in the world of sports. It was the passing of a legendary figure in basketball by the name of Bill Russell. Here he is in this picture. I could have shown you another picture of him where he's wearing 11 NBA championship rings. He's got 2 on one finger because he can't fit them all on his fingers. Many people believe that Bill Russell might be the most accomplished team sport athlete ever to play. Not because he was the best athlete himself, but because he did all these things that were needed to do to win. He was all about the team, and he won a whole lot. More than 28 different teams in the NBA. He won more titles, just him, in his 13 seasons playing basketball. And he did all this as a black athlete in the 1960s, which was not easy to be. And so for many years of his life, he would be in the stadium in Boston, and people would be chanting his name and cheering him on. And then he would go home to find that his house had been vandalized. People had written racial slurs on the walls inside his house and taken things from his property. He'd go and travel with a team and not be allowed to eat in the same restaurants as some of his other teammates. And even as he won championship after championship, many people would say that it is only because of Bob Cousy, his teammate, his white teammate, that he was able to win all these championships. Well, together, Bob Cousy and Bill Russell, they won a whole lot of championships, played very well together. A few years ago, someone was doing an interview with Bob Cousy. He was 90 years old by the time they did this interview. They were asking him about his playing career. They were asking about Bill Russell. He didn't really want to talk about all the different championships that they had won. Instead, he wanted to talk about Bill and what Bill had been through. And the thing he kept saying is that I just really think I could have been a better friend to him back then. Here's his quote. "I should have been much more sensitive to Russell and his anguish in those days." He got a little teary-eyed, and they kind of had to stop the interview. And later he wrote Bill Russell a letter. They hadn't talked in years. He said, "It was my responsibility to reach out to you and hopefully share the pain that you had during that period or minimize it, but I didn't do that." And he sent that letter. Well, a few months passed. He happened to run into Bill Russell at this charity event that they were both part of. They hadn't talked to each other in years. He saw him. He wondered kind of what might come of all of this. Bill Russell came and gave him a big hug. He said they had the first meaningful conversation together that they had ever had in all those years that they had been teammates. When I heard that story, I thought, man, that is what 2 Chronicles wants to do for us. 2 Chronicles wants us to really think about how we live. It wants us to think about what's the right thing to do. In the way we live, like here and now, it wants to bring us to those moments of clarity that we all have. Bob Cousy had one, where we know that sometimes we could have chosen better. But far from leaving us in those moments, this book wants to motivate us to do what Bob Cousy did. To choose the best path that we can. Try to mend what may be broken. Try to do what we can to turn to a better way. Knowing that if we should return, we have a God who's even more infinitely ready to embrace us and hear us and forgive us. And as long as we still have a life that is history being written, we are still blessed with the opportunity to make it a life that's history worth repeating. Together this fall, we're going to work on doing that. Maybe that speaks to you tonight. Maybe we can be challenged already by what Chronicles is going to say to us. Chronicles is a lot about turning our hearts and our lives to God, and it could be that in our lives right now we need to do that. When we offer an invitation, it's a great opportunity to reflect on that and respond to it. This is a time when we also make it available to respond to the gospel, the ultimate opportunity to turn to God and experience his hearing us and forgiving us, as we know he's able to do. As we sing this next song, let's prepare to respond while we stand, while we sing.